Now, I am really, really excited to introduce our next speaker. I was hoping to get a chance to talk with her on our last, our March summit, but I'm so happy to get to speak with her today with all of you. So Marcelle Ciampi is an autistic author and the senior manager of DEI at Ultranauts Inc. Now, in addition to all of this, Marcelle is a worldwide ambassador and consultant, best known for her book, Everyday Asperger's. Now, as an expert in the field of neurodiversity in the workplace, Marcel serves as the senior manager of DEI, and Ultranauts Inc., in case you haven't heard of them, is an engineering firm with an autism hiring initiative. Now, as a contributing author of the book Spectrum Women, Walking to the Beat of Autism, Marcel is also the founder of Spectrum Suite LLC, co-executive at neuroguides.org, and an advisor to autism organizations and conferences around the world. Marcel's newest manuscript is called Autism in a Brief Case, Straight Talk About Belonging in a Neurodiverse World. And she resides in the Pacific Northwest with her neurodivergent fiance, David Hall, and their puppy, George Bailey. So welcome, Marcy. I'm so happy to get to speak with you today. Is there anything else that you want our audience to know about you before we dive into this amazing topic?
I love your enthusiasm. It's wonderful. It's lighting up the virtual room here.
Oh, thank you.
No, I think that's plenty about me. Let's dive into the topic. People are welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn and continue the conversation there if they want to know anything more about what I've been doing or what I'm up to.
Heck yes, I love that. So we're so happy to have you here to talk about this subject of the neurodivergent experience in remote work, and how organizations obviously need to kind of improve and also continuously keep improving. So before we dive into that, could you kind of briefly explain to attendees a little bit about your background and your relation to the topic and the community of neurodivergency?
Sure, thank you. I was diagnosed with being on the autism spectrum, then Asperger's, about 11, 12 years ago. And it was 7 years after my son was diagnosed, my middle son, who's now an adult and doing very well. From there, my journey led me to processing my late age diagnosis. And then I like to jest that I had a lot of processing to do. I ended up writing over 500,000 words online. Most of them related specifically to what does this mean, having a late age diagnosis of autism, being an autistic individual. I also became interested in working for Ultranauts about 7 years ago. I was their first recruiter, later the recruitment manager, and largely credited for designing a lot of the universal design inclusivity practices that we have in place for the candidate selection process and community engagement and so forth.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I am also a fellow very late in life diagnoser. I got a diagnosis of bipolar type 2 about 2 years ago. And as a 33-year-old, that was surprising. And so I very much relate to your whole experience of this late diagnosis and sort of trying to kind of take on that paradigm shift of what this means for you, and how this is going to affect or impact your life. Now, when it comes to at-home work, I feel like we've had different levels of success depending on each person's individual situation and what your company is like when it comes to remote work. What are some of your suggestions for remote workers that might not, especially when it comes to people who might have faced different challenges within office work than they might now face when it comes to working remotely?
So there's two sides really, that it's the worker's experience in their environment at home. And then there's also the employer's experience, the supervisors, the authority figures. So there's two sides of it. Workers themselves, what they can do in their home environment. I'm speaking from my own experience here. I've been working remotely from home for over 7.5 years. I'm also in a remote program for my college as well. Is create spaces in your home that are nurturing sensory-wise. For many people, almost all people who are autistic, sensory issues are difficult, such as the humming of the fridge, the heater clicking on and off, the comfort of a couch. So seeking out places that make you comfortable. I am not that good at that. And it was actually my fiance, David, after we've known each other for quite a while, he encouraged me to get a pillow for the back of my office chair and to get a footrest for my feet. I tended to overlook that and treat my home like an office. Like, what would I do to make going to work comfortable and inviting and welcoming every day? Well, what can I do at home to do that? Also, you don't have to be in just one room. I mean, some of us do if we have noisy pets or children that are running around, but I love to rotate and sometimes go where there's the most sun, or other times I might need more quiet if we have the privilege and luxury of having more than one small space to go to, that is. Also, creating times for you, some type of messaging, whether that's a buddy checking in on you and saying, hey, you need to take a break. Have you taken a break today? That accountability, even assigning a friend or a coworker, let's do a 10-minute break together and have a discussion, even though we have all of this work to do. Self-care is so important. It took me several years to start taking breaks as a remote worker. And especially for the neurodivergent individual, people who are autistic, ADHDers, dyslexic, dyspraxia, anybody who has a brain or mind that varies significantly from the mainstream norm, we tend to hyper focus, many of us, and I can go 12, 15 hours straight without a break. So having that accountability built in for yourself and for your coworkers. You can also do reminders on your phone, alarms, putting your phone in another room, or your Hey Google or Siri, that there's an alarm that goes off that you actually have to get up and go turn it off somewhere. I have found that helpful as well. And asking yourself, what can I do to be the best performer for myself at work? What I love about remote work in my schedule is 3 days a week. When I get up the energy, I go to swim therapy on my lunch break. So what can you do in the middle of your day to break up your day? Take advantage of it. And also talk to your supervisors and your coworkers about flex time. Many of us work best at different times of the day. Some of us are morning people, some of us are night owls, some of us need a lot of coffee before we can get started, others don't. And I tend to do some of my best work in bursts, maybe from 5 a.m. to noon. And if I've already worked 7 hours, why is it that I need to continue to be working after lunch for another 4 or 5 hours? So talking about that flex time, self-advocating for yourself, identifying your own needs, what works best for you. It wasn't until just a couple years ago, actually more like a year ago, and I'm in my 50s, that I started to realize some of the things that work best for me as far as learning. And the doctoral program forced me to do a lot of that. I use yellow legal pads. They're much easier for me to retain information and look, because I'm also dyslexic, to remember things from. I need to write down a lot of reminders, checklists. So analyze what works best for you. I prefer a widescreen computer because of my dyslexia. So do a self-inventory of how can I not only be the best worker, bring my best self to work and be a top performer, but how also can I nurture myself so I can continue to do that?
Excellent. And you're right. I mean, I've been working remotely for 3 years. So I had the luxury of moving from an in-person setting to what was my first remote job, but I got to do it in a purposeful and slow way, knowing that the entire company was remote and all of that. So I was really lucky in that, like, I didn't have to do this in a, kind of in a rush, under the strain and all of the unknowns that were part of the pandemic, especially the onset, in 2020. So I think you're right. It's definitely it's definitely a concern and a thing that should be a paradigm shift for people. But I feel like you're right. A lot of us don't think in terms of how do I make my home setting more productive for myself. They think in terms of, like, how do you replicate the workplace? And you're right. I mean, it might be as simple as, keeping a blanket at your desk if you tend to get cold versus, like you said, moving to different rooms. That's something that I've noticed. I work better when I'm comfortable. And if I'm cold, I'm not
Exactly.
working well. So some days,
Well, and also to that point, reports say that 20 to 30% of us that are employed identify with having at least one disability. I am physically disabled. I have been for many years. 90% of my work is done in bed. So that, thinking outside the box, I have a nice setup on my bed and I have all my things spread out and all the tables near me with everything I need. One of the wonderful things about remote workplace is it is becoming more accessible to have jobs for people who are disabled or who identify as being disabled individuals.
Yes, very important highlight. Leandra is in the chat agreeing with you. Leandra said, if I don't set alarms, I will go from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. in a split second. Hyper focus mode is too real. I very much identify with this as well. All right, let's shift the topic to Ultranauts. Now, I know that they are known for their universal workplace and really pride themselves on the best inclusivity practices. So can you tell us what kind of inclusivity practices are implemented in that remote workspace that Ultranauts has been doing?
Sure. And there's some articles online as well that I can point the readers to if they want to reach out to me afterward. So we call it the universal workplace, and I've worked closely with key leaders and the CEO, the founder, one of the co-founders of the company, to design a place of inclusivity. And what we've done is we're a 100% remote company, so we're not focused on how to make the environment, the physical environment, accessible, because that's up to each of the individuals from their workspace at home. What we are focused on is how to make our procedures and processes and systems and the way they communicate and interact accessible. So we've transferred the universal workplace inclusivity thought. We've broken that paradigm outside that paradigm. The new paradigm is, well, how can we make it an inclusive place for us as human beings as we interact? And we've had growing pains. We're not doing anything perfectly, but we've learned so much and we've become a role model for other industries and corporations with some of our practices. Some of the things we do is we have a biodex, which is a form that each of the employees, team members fills out, and it talks about a little bit about their background, their work hours, where they are in the world, how they appreciate getting feedback. Do you want it right away? Would you like me to wait a week before I get back to you? What are some of their strengths? What are some of their skills? What are some of their challenges? And we also have opportunity to share a little bit more about our personal life if we like to. That helps people who are engaging and working remotely, especially the supervisors and managers, to get a quick peek at who's on my team and who am I involved with, and how can I best support that team member? What makes them tick? What doesn't? What irritates them? That's one of the best things that we've done to help with that remote communication. We also have bi-weekly team forums where people are paid to come for an hour like this in a Zoom format, and it's led by my fiance, David, who is a trained professional, and he's also autistic. And he leads a group of non-autistics and autistics every other week in a meeting about what's happening in the world, how can we support one another, what are triggers, what are things that we can do as a company to make the effects of the wider world less for our workers, if that makes sense. It's about comforting and connection, and we're missing a lot of that in the workplace because of the situations in the last 2 years. And we had a loneliness scale before COVID. We compared to the general population who reported feeling lonely at work 40% of the time, 40% loneliness scale. As a 100% remote company, before the pandemic, we were at only 5% of feeling lonely compared to 40. And after the pandemic, those even dropped more. So we're really focused on engagement and how we can make work not only a work experience, but a human experience. We also have once a month community gatherings where, again, part of that is paid time, and people, it's completely optional. Both these meetings are. People can gather and talk about what's working in our workplace and what can be improved. And then that's followed by a social time where we have like, would you rather, or bingo, or some type of activity, so people that can connect and get to know each other better. Some other things we do is we focus on feedback loops. More recently, we're focusing on trauma-informed feedback loops because many people on the autistic spectrum also have PTSD like myself, or complex PTSD. And a lot of us have suffered, not autistic, but human beings in general, with trauma and anxiety and stress from the global health crises and the social justice unrest and the political unrest. So moving into a lens of what does trauma-informed workplace look like, and what does a trauma-informed feedback loops look like? So if I'm a supervisor and I'm going to provide somebody with feedback, and I'm aware that they have PTSD and perhaps they've been traumatized in college or the workplace before by a bully or a critical supervisor, how can I approach that individual? What types of resources are out there for the supervisor to read and review? And what types of discussions, those vulnerable, brave spaces, can we create so that people who have experienced trauma and anxiety can talk about that and people are aware? Kudos to one of our key players at the company who last year, during a company-wide business meeting that we regularly have once a month, and it was supposed to be business as usual, stats and clients and profit and loss. And instead, in an impromptu moment, this individual decided to share with the whole workforce their experience for about 20 minutes, their experience with depression throughout their life and how they're struggling and what they're doing about it. One of the things that we all can do as authority figures in the workplace, whether that's an official title or not, as influencers, as key thought leaders, is to be more vulnerable, to bring our authentic self forward and say, I'm a human being. Yeah, I have these challenges as well. When that happened, when the supervisor shared this personal information, the chat room in Zoom lit up with, this is a wonderful place to work. This is why I'm here. I'm so glad I work here, which is testimony to when we act as human beings and not as these untouchable superiors, how we can build a sense of belonging and sense of inclusion. And depression after that conversation, in my opinion, at our workplace was no longer seen through a deficit lens, but through a social model of disability, through a lens of we all have strengths, we all have weaknesses, and how wonderful that we have created this space where we can interact and share this personal information with one another, and how sharing that information is going to help us be better colleagues, better team members, and better workers for the bottom line of the company.
Yes. Oh my gosh. I'm listening, and I feel like at the end of every sentence, I just want to scream, oh my gosh, yes. But yeah, you're right. It's one of those things where if you're thinking about it in terms more of your employees, not just as workers, but as whole people, you're right, it does kind of help lend a more clarity to that lens through which you should really be viewing not only your supervisor or your direct reports, but also your teammates, people that are on your same level. That kind of understanding and at least, even attempt to try and look outside yourself is so important. We did have a really great question from the chat. If you don't mind sharing this information with us, Carolyn had said, that they find that people with mental disabilities or challenges often get pigeonholed into certain types of jobs, factories, grocery stores, food service, these kinds of things. How did you break through the glass ceiling of these of this sort of presupposition about where people with neurodivergencies work best?
That's we could have a whole hour discussion on that. Wonderful question. I do want to, before I forget, remind myself to remind you that we have free Ultranaut webinars once a quarter. And we're going to have some Ultranaut employees speaking about their autistic experience, different generations of being autistic, on April 28th, 12 Eastern. And you can connect with me on LinkedIn, and we can answer some of these questions just like that. So I write a lot about this. If you Google my name, Marcelle Ciampi, I can put it in chat in a minute, and LinkedIn articles, a lot will come up about this exact topic. And in fact, I coined a word called diversity with dignity, because I was being invited to so many platforms where I was the only autistic person there. There wasn't equal representation, and it wasn't nothing about us without us. It was people talking about the autistic experience who weren't autistic, or talking about the disabilities who weren't disabled. And I started to write more and more about that and speak more and more about the rights of autistic people and those with similar neurological profiles. There is a Facebook group that has over 300 autistics that are in the medical field, that are doctors. There's many autistics who are teachers. There's autistics that are lawyers. There's autistics in every type of job, just like there's human beings in every type of job. And one of the things that some of these autism hiring programs and now neurodiversity hiring programs have done, hopefully and intentionally, is that we've created this othering and this ableism, that autistic people are less than and they need this help, and every autistic person needs a job coach, and every autistic person should be in labor or in tech, that every autistic person is a white cisgender middle-class male living in his parents' basement. So we've been fighting a lot of these stereotypes and a lot of these generalizations and continually trying to raise awareness. My journey in becoming not pigeonholed was largely due to the fact I didn't know I was autistic. I went to school, got my degree, became a teacher, got a master's degree in teaching. It wasn't until I became aware that I was autistic and disclosed that I started to be pigeonholed, and people started to make assumptions about me that I couldn't be this and I couldn't do that, and that I needed unsolicited advice, when I've been studying communication and psychology and people relationships since I was 6 years old, and would sit under the yellow school buses and take notes of people walking by and their behavior. So we need to be careful about the assumptions that we make about people and what they are lacking and what they might need, and also not to make them into superheroes and highlight their strengths. Diversity with dignity is holding a space for someone's dignity, for their self-respect, for valuing them as a human being because they exist, not because of something they can do for you, or not because they make you feel better because you're superior to them. So this is a very complex question, a fantastic question, and thank you for asking it.
Absolutely. All right, we only have 4 minutes left. I'm going to try and get to one more question because this was really great. And then we will, thank you so much for sharing that information about Ultranauts. I see that we've got somebody else from Ultranauts in the chat sharing links, so thank you so much for that. Milagros had asked, I've heard PTSD brought up as a joke in many workplaces, and it's very triggering. I've even voiced concerns over it and was ridiculed and told that only vets have PTSD and wasn't taken seriously. How do you recommend those of us within, communities handle these types of situations when they occur? And I think this is a really great subject, because you're right. You had talked about trauma earlier, and PTSD is not just for vets, and trauma does not just look like sexual assault or being a victim of a violent crime or, being at any way ostracized from something. There are all kinds of trauma. So what do you recommend for people who are experiencing these kinds of either microaggressions or experiences at the workplace that they know aren't right and shouldn't continue?
Yes.
Do you recommend speaking up, or what would you say to this person?
Excellent question. I'm also, I'm an ADHDer as well, so my mind's going off in all these different directions for how I can answer this question.
Right.
So I'm a teacher at heart. I always go to education. That's my first. How can you educate people? How can you become a self-advocate and an advocate for other people if you have the spoons left, if you have the emotional energy and resilience to do that? What literature, what guest presenters can you bring into your organization so that you can expand this knowledge? From a self-advocate point of view, put things in writing, report it, put it in an email. I have found through advocating through the years for my son in the school system, the more things that you can put in writing and leave a trail, a paper trail, the more accountability people are going to have on the other end. So if something was happening at our company, we also have feedback loops in place. We have daily polls, weekly polls, sometimes yearly polls, and surveys about what's working and not working at your company. If you're not able to let somebody know that something is happening that's triggering you emotionally and that could feasibly affect your work and your personal life, then that is an indication that something in the workplace system needs to be addressed. And bringing that to attention in some format, whatever that looks like, going to an HR, going to a trusted confidant, going to an ERG, employee resource group, starting an employee resource group with disabilities, and starting to talk about this conversation. But to me, this is a red flag if you don't know where to go with it and you don't know how to find the support. So the bigger picture is, why don't you know how to find that support? Why isn't it clear? Why isn't that given to you from day one in onboarding, so you know who to go to if you're experiencing something that makes you uncomfortable?
Excellent. Thank you so much for diving in on this with us. Marcy, we are at the end of our time today, but is there anything else you want to leave our audience with before we move on into our next session?
Please feel free to reach out to me. We also have a free Diversity with Dignity Global Roundtable that we do once a quarter, where we talk about topics just like this. And we invite you to come, and I hope to see or to connect with some of you that are on LinkedIn and in other social media. And thank you so much for having me here today. And it was a pleasure having the conversation.
Thank you so much, Marcy. It's been a joy to get to sit and talk to you. Thank you so much for sharing your time, your expertise, as well as your experiences, with this community. It's very invaluable. So thank you so much for that.
And love your glasses and hair.
Thank you. All right. Yes, absolutely.